And this is kind of out of sequence. We're having a special or a study session prior to a meeting, but this is something that is, we try to do this every year, or at least with each new council. And Tammy Tenoy is general counsel for SRSA, and she has over the years come and talked to us about how to keep us out of trouble. And so it's always good to hear, and this will be number 10, 11, 12 that I've heard Tammy, and I always still learn something new and am reminded of things that we have to pay attention to. And there's a lot that changes also. There's some new things going on with social media and those types of things. So we really need to know these things, understand these things, and live by these things. And then Kathy Novak, who is just a tremendous professional development trainer, has worked with electeds for years, served as North Glen mayor, council for years. So she comes from a place of knowing our world, and she has some great stuff to share with us too. And so we have about an hour and a half. We don't have a hard stop at 7:30. If we're having an engaging conversation, we can go a bit longer. I will hard stop us at 8 for certain. I think that will be okay with the council.
I'll encourage you to.
Thank you.
Bring your sleep bag.
Jerry's encouragement is always.
Don't make me laugh.
I know, you can't laugh. A bunch of us laughs. So we'll go ahead, and Tammy's going to do her presentation. Kathy will do hers, and then there's going to be an opportunity to kind of share with both. So, Tammy, go ahead and start in.
Great. Thanks very much, Mayor and members of the council. Thanks so much for having me back, especially those of you who have heard me 8 to 12 times before. I appreciate your sticking around and hearing me yet again. And to those of you who are new, I know there are several new faces here. Congratulations, I think. I mean, truly, congratulations. It really is a wonderful thing to serve your municipality in this fashion, and so you have 100% of my admiration. Just one thing by way of disclaimer, and that is that when there's more than one attorney in the room, there's not always agreement. And just in case I say anything that is in any way different from what Steve tells you as your city attorney, why Steve is always right and I am always wrong. So I just want to put that disclaimer on the record. The other thing I should mention is that this is kind of a standard presentation, and so in case you are thinking to yourself, hey, I resemble that remark, please rest assured that that is strictly coincidental. I do give this around the state, and any resemblance, frankly, is because, common issues do surface up among city councils and board of trustees. So over the years, if you've been listening, I started with 6 or 8 suggestions that I went through, and before I retire, I swear I'm going to get it down to one magical suggestion. But for now, I really have 2 areas that I want to talk about, one being governance versus administration, and then a little bit about personal conduct towards one another, staff, and the community. So I don't know if any of you are students of policy governance. It seems as though that is a concept that has taken root more in school districts than among cities. But I just want to alert you that we have an expert that we collaborate with at SRSA, whose name is Ken Schutz. And we actually pick up half of the cost of your exploration of his version of policy governance, if you're ever interested in doing so. So please let me know if that is the case. Just a couple words about policy governance. I'm sure you've heard this before, that the focus of a governing body such as yours should be on the ends, the big picture goals and priorities of the organization, while your CEO, your manager, and staff should focus on selecting and then carrying out the means to achieve your ends. And so that kind of leads to the other broad work of policy governance, which is that you can't have your managers just select any means, right? There have to be boundaries of ethics and law and prudence beyond which he must not cross. And so that's the other broad work of policy governance, and that is to set appropriate boundaries around your manager and staff. And that's kind of policy governance in a nutshell. One thing I have learned about elected officials over the years is this, and tell me if you agree or disagree, that compared to the rest of the population, all of you are excellent managers of the rest of your lives. And the reason I say this is I compare you guys to myself. I'm doing all I can with my work life, my home life, my dogs, a little bit of charity work. I don't have spare time left over to say, I'll just run a city. And clearly you guys do. You've got the time, the resources, the energy to do that. So you must be great managers, is my only conclusion. But governance and management are not the same thing. And so if you come to a governing body like this thinking, I'm going to really use those management skills, you will find, I think, over time that they are different muscle groups, different skill sets, and governance really is not the same thing as management. This is my own sort of maybe naive org chart or chain of command, but I use this to illustrate a number of points. So we start with the ownership of the organization, which of course would be the citizens, and then we move to the governing body, the manager, department heads and other supervisors, and then frontline employees. I use this to illustrate a few things. Number one, time horizons. If you look at the time horizons of your frontline employees, I would say they're very short, right? What do I need to get done today? Your supervisors are going to have their time horizons a little bit further out. What do we need to accomplish this week, maybe? Your department heads are looking at the month and the rest of the year. Your city manager is looking at the whole year and probably the 5-year plan and beyond. But you, the governing body, should have the longest time horizons of anybody in the organization. And so this is one way in which you can gauge whether what's taking up your time and energy is putting you in the right place in the organization. Because if what's taking up your time and energy is what's happening right now today, or even worse, what happened yesterday, then I would suggest that that might be telling you that your time horizons are putting you in the wrong place in the organization. Yours need to be way out there, 15, 20, 50 years. The other thing I use this for is to illustrate my contention about dealings within the chain of command. And tell me if you agree or disagree with this. So between the governing body and frontline employees, my contention is this, that nobody in the organization should be jumping up or down more than one level in dealing with others in the organization. So frontline employees should be dealing primarily with their own supervisors. You, the city council, should be dealing primarily with your own direct reports. Any level that you jump over or allow to be jumped over is a level in the organization that becomes disempowered. Agree or disagree?
Agree.
Right? Because if you allow frontline employees to say, I'm not happy with what's going on with my supervisor, maybe my department head, and so you're my elected official, I'm going to pull you into my business, then you have just allowed jumping over and you have disempowered those levels within the organization. Sometimes it happens from, the bottom up. Somebody will try to pull you into their business. Other times I've seen instances where elected officials will take it upon themselves to become interested in lower levels in the organization. But it doesn't really matter where that impetus comes from. If it's happening, then parts of your organization are being disempowered. And the worst case scenario is this, and I see this all the time. This kind of jumping up and down is happening. Levels are being disempowered, up to and including the city manager. And then the city council is looking around going, hey, why do we have such an ineffective management team? Well, excuse me, maybe all that jumping up and down through the organization led to the chaos that disempowered all of these people that you are criticizing now. And so this is a very real phenomenon that I think has to be guarded against. And the final thing that I use this little org chart for is the concept of no redundancy. At the administrative levels of the organization, there's kind of room for people to cover for one another, and the organization has the resources, the redundancy to absorb that, right? So for instance, if a supervisor finds that several frontline employees are out sick that week, it's not a big deal for that supervisor to say, I got to do some frontline employment work this week. Or a department head might say, I'm going to have to assume some supervisory duties because I've got some vacancies in my department. The organization can absorb that. But at your level, if your attention were to be diverted away from governance, say into management, that's sometimes something that happens, right? We're not happy with the vacuum that seems to have formed, and so we're going to be, delving into management for a while. If that happens, does the organization have the resources to absorb that, to where somebody else can jump down to your level and say, hey, the city council's attention seems to be diverted away from governance, so we'll just jump down and do that for you for the next several months? No, there is no such redundancy within the organization. And so that's another of many reasons why it's so critical to guard jealously that governance area, because nobody else can do it but yourselves. One voice. How many voices are there on the city council? 7, right. And I hope that each of you brings an equal voice to your deliberations and discussions. But there does come a point when that discussion funnels into a decision, a vote, right? At that point, how many voices should there be? 1, right? Is this a discipline that you feel as though the council here in Littleton is effectively exercising? That once a decision is made, you speak with one voice about it, no matter where you might have stood in the deliberations? I hope it is, because I think it is a critical discipline. Sometimes you're going to be on the wrong end of a vote. Other times you're going to be in the majority. No matter where you are, right? At some point, you're going to say, I really wish the rest of my colleagues would respect the will of the majority, right? And so you can't be in the minority saying, I'm just going to continue to pursue my dissenting voice, because at some point you're going to be in the majority, and then you will wish for that courtesy to have been accorded to the will of the majority. So it really is a mutual discipline, I think, that has to be exercised. Also, how many voices should be aimed at your direct reports once a decision is made? 1, right? Is this something that is sometimes observed in the breach? I spent many years as a city attorney, sitting where Steve is sitting, taking good notes, getting my marching orders, understanding what I was to do for the next meeting, and then getting phone calls or emails whereby somebody who was not in the majority on that decision would try to undermine subtly, right, the marching orders that I had been given. And then now suddenly I was trying to go in 3, 4 directions at once. Is that kind of crazy making from the standpoint of your direct reports? Does that ever happen in Littleton? I don't think it does. I'm sure it doesn't. But it has happened. And, being crazy making for your staff is one thing, but to have your clear direction kind of disintegrate into multiple directions is, I think, something that you should be directly concerned about, because it's not a good thing.
Tammy,
Yes.
oftentimes when things like that sort of happen, it almost is as if it's happening unintentionally. So what are some of the things to keep in mind? Because I think that assuming best of intentions from all, oftentimes you only learn after you've gotten in trouble for doing it. So what are some of the things that might be traps that would start that behavior?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So one of the things that I hear in sort of a pushback on this is, well, does that mean that I have to kind of, be this lockstep supporter on something that I didn't necessarily support? And do I have to, take the propaganda party line on something that I didn't necessarily support because I have trouble doing that. And I think that's a legitimate concern. And so how do you walk that tightrope, I think, is one of the areas where you can kind of step off into the wrong territory. You know, if you continue to dissent and undermine, I think that's the wrong approach. If you're open with somebody who asks, hey, what was your position on such and such? You can say something like, well, as you know, if you were at the council meeting or listened to the video, I had some concerns about it, but my view of things did not carry the day. The majority went in this direction, and because this is a group that operates by majority, I'm honoring that position. But you know from the record that I didn't necessarily agree with it. So I think you can take a position of integrity without undermining. I think that's probably the tightrope that has to be walked. With the staff, once a clear direction has been established, I would say don't try to sway them even a little bit because they understand what the direction is, right? If they get it wrong, then a majority will set them right. I don't think it's necessary or appropriate for somebody who was on the wrong side of that policy level discussion to try to sway it back before the rest of the council has had a chance to have another say on it. So does that make sense, Mark and Steve? So yes.
Because we are elected in staggered wins, I think I have sometimes said, the council voted this way, it's either unanimous, but when it isn't, there is a possibility that in the next election, citizens will elect people with different views, and council may or may not decide to revisit this. So I just let people know that this is a dynamic group. And because I think, Deb, we changed some things after we were first elected.
I don't think that's inappropriate. As long as you're looking for legally sound avenues to revisit when appropriate, I don't see a problem with that. Just keep in mind, though, that there are some risks to revisiting because there are some types of decisions that do get pretty well locked in. And so there may not be legally appropriate avenues for them. And I would say one good example of that would be the approval of a contract, right, with an outside contractor. And that contractor then says, I'm relying on your approval. I am expending funds in reliance on this, on your approval and the contract terms. If you were to pull that contract out from under that contractor at that point, I don't think you could avoid a liability. So you can't always find an appropriate avenue, but oftentimes you certainly can.
The budget priorities are
Sure.
a good illustration.
Yep. Annually, absolutely. Yep. Good point.
But
yes.
does that suggest that there is a different sense of value to, a 5-2 vote than a 4-3 vote? At the end of the day, it's still the majority of the body has made a decision, whether it's 4, 5, or 6. The majority has made a decision, so you take that action. It just feels like it's a slippery slope.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I don't think that once you have locked in on a majority vote that you should be looking at, well, it was only 4-3 as opposed to 5-2. It was a majority vote, right? Really, at that point, the number of votes doesn't matter, except as sort of, stick it in the back pocket for future, if and when ever appropriate, right? Because maybe it only takes one person to feel different. But you're absolutely right in terms of the legal weight of that decision. It's the same if it's a majority vote, no matter how many were. Absolutely. So, governance versus management. Why is Tammy, who's associated with your self-insurance pool and cares about liability, why does she even talk about that? Is there a liability connection to governance versus administration? I would maintain that there is, because really when you look at your charter, it sets forth job descriptions, right, for the council and for the manager. And those job descriptions really are the source of your best legal protection from liability. When you're acting within the parameters of your job description and not somebody else's, then you have the best protections under state law from potential liability. You also have the best protections through SRSA from potential liability, because we cover you when you're within the course and scope of your authorized duties. So that's why I do feel as though there's definitely a liability connection here. Also, to the extent that you're trying to sit in somebody else's seat, right, the administration's seat, chaos can only be the result, right? People are like, well, wait a minute, right? Is this your job, my job? And so from that standpoint, the avoidance of chaos, I believe, is a sound risk management suggestion. So personal conduct. I think you would agree with me that the way that you conduct yourself in relation to your colleagues, the staff, and the community can greatly impact your effectiveness as a member of the governing body. I hope you would agree with me that municipal governance is a team activity. Anybody feel differently? That you're here as a lone wolf, and by golly, you're going to, accomplish your things by yourself? Can't happen, right? It is purely a team activity. I look at elected officials who are successful and not successful, and the not successful ones, I think to myself, I'll bet they flunked plays well with others in kindergarten, right? Because plays well with others, I think, is really a critical skill. If you're going to convert your personal agenda to the agenda of a majority, then that really does require excellent teamwork skills. Also, maybe I'm the only one who's noticed this at other levels of government, but are we seeing any incivility and divisiveness at other levels? Maybe it is just me. It's just me. But I do feel as though it is kind of starting to creep through other levels of government, and things are getting ugly, and I've seen things getting ugly even in municipal government, where we're supposed to be the haven of nonpartisanship, right? We're the grown-ups in the room. And so, I feel as though that sense of nonpartisanship really is what lies between us and what's happening at other levels of government. And partisanship, of course, can take many forms, right? There's political partisanship, which technically does not exist in municipal government because, we're not R's or D's in municipal government. We don't have that partisan filter. And I don't think we need that partisan filter in municipal government. But there are other kinds of partisanship that I think can creep in. Sometimes it's in-crowd versus out-crowd, or newbies versus old-timers. I was speaking at CML last summer, and some young elected officials raised their hands, and they were like, we feel disrespected on our councils just because we're young, right?
Snowflakes.
Like,
Snowflakes. No, sorry.
Exactly. So I feel like there are many ways in which we can kind of divide ourselves up and put on these partisan filters that get in the way of mutual understanding. Electeds versus staff, I think, is another form of partisanship. Continued allegiance or hanging on to a single interest, right? Or even a single interest group that might have been pivotal, right, in compelling you to run for office, right? If you hang on to that after you have now attained the position of all issues decision maker, then you could have a partisan filter that's affecting your ability to be fully effective on the governing body. And that's not to say, that partisanship is wrong. I accept the need for it at other levels of government. If you look at Congress, for instance, what do they have? 3,000 bills a year? I haven't counted, but that seems like a not too wild estimate. And so you've got to have a partisan filter, right? Otherwise, you're like agonizing over your position newly on every single one of those 3,000 bills that comes before you. And so that partisan filter does become useful. But at the municipal level, while the issues are of critical daily importance to your citizens, I think the sheer numbers of the issues are not so much that the partisan filter is useful or necessary. The other thing that I sometimes see is that people who are critics of the status quo will seek public office, right? And that also is a good thing, right? It's wonderful that somebody says, by my efforts, I can help make things better. But if you hold on to that outsider or critic role after you have joined the ranks of the ultimate insiders, then again, I would suggest that you might be wearing a filter that would limit your effectiveness. Single issues. There is no room for a single issue agenda once you become the all issues decision maker. And there was a guy in a very remote rural town, very few resources. I mean, it's one of those you read about in the paper that, seems to be dying on the vine. And it's sad to me that in this wonderful state, we do have some communities that really are struggling like that. But he said that his single issue that propelled him to seek office was, by golly, he was going to lower water and sewer rates, right? Once he joined the city council and understood the economics of running the water and sewer system, he had to let that single issue agenda fall away. And I was like, kudos to you, man, because I know of other cities where they have not let that issue fall away. And it's like, dude, fiduciary duty, right? Single issue agenda. You're going to wreck your water and sewer system because you made this promise before you knew anything about, right, the economics of the water and sewer system. So I was like, kudos to you, right, for recognizing that and for shifting your goals and priorities. I versus we. So I see troubling instances where individual elected officials will act as I rather than we. If you accept the proposition that this is a team activity, then there's not a whole lot of room for acting as I when it comes to actions as a council member on the governing body. In fact, if you look at your home rule charter, I defy you to show me a place where it says a council member may or a council member must, right? All of your responsibilities are set forth in the collective, right? So there's no room for I, the council member, to do much of anything other than appear here, discuss, deliberate, and vote, right, as a body. So anything you do that involves I rather than we potentially takes you outside your job description and can be risky. Constituent service. Have any of you come to find that that's part of your responsibility, that citizens will call you and say, hey, I need help with permit
Trash.
issue, right, trash issue, pothole issue, barking dog issue, weed issue. What is the one thing that unites all of these issues? Are any of them governance issues? No. Not a one, not ever, right? They're all administrative issues. And so I'm not saying you don't have a role in constituent service. I'm not saying that you have to tell a citizen, not my problem, right? Certainly there are more hospitable ways to deal with that, but once you become more than a conduit, right, helping somebody get to the right people to get the response, once you do more than just act as a conduit, then I think potentially you could be overstepping the bounds of I versus we, and also overstepping the bounds of governance versus administration. So I maintain that constituent service, while important, is one of those areas that can be risky if not undertaken correctly. Does this issue of, do I represent my ward or the city, does that ever surface up here in Littleton? I've been working with Denver, oddly enough. They're not a member of CIRSA, but they called upon me. And I talked to this council member who was like, my only job is to advocate for the residents in my ward. That's it. Do any of you take that view of your responsibilities? I hope not, because if that were the case, why do we need a city council, right? Why can't we just have a ward czar and you just decide what happens in your ward, right? There has to be a balance between representing the interests of your ward, which, while critically important, you also have to take the bigger view of things, right? And so my hope is that you don't wear those, advocate for my ward is my only job kind of perspective on things. And the other thing is, not everything affects your ward, right? And so should you be saying, I'm not even going to vote, or you shouldn't be allowed to vote, it's not part of your ward, right? No. You're a citywide council member elected from a ward. So I do hope that you kind of achieve your harmonious balance on those two interests, wards versus city as a whole. Do I respect the will of the majority even when in the minority? We've talked about that a little bit. It is, I think, a critical discipline. Confidentiality breaches. Littleton is, I think, almost unique in having pretty restrictive provisions when it comes to executive sessions. And, I respect the voters for having done that, but it certainly does make for some difficult times because there is a need for confidential communications, right? And they may not fit within the very small box that's been created for executive sessions. I versus we comes into place when it comes to confidences of the city. Who decides whether something should be confidential? You, the client, right? Who then should decide whether to waive that confidentiality? Shouldn't it be all of you, not just one of you, right? And so if one of you were to say, okay, I know this is a confidential attorney-client memo, but I'm just going to, then have you just acted as I rather than we? Most definitely. And in past years, I've certainly been aware of council members who ended up getting into big trouble over those kinds of confidentiality breaches. Would you say that the equality of information, the equality or the weight, the equal weight of your sort of power on the council, the equality of your say is a value that all of you would subscribe to? Right? No one of you should have a disproportionate share of the 1/7 power that each of you holds, right? I see different ways in which an imbalance happens. One is when one person dominates the discussion during a council meeting. At one city where I was called in to do this training, I learned that there was a council member who will often filibuster for an hour or more on a single topic. Now, if each of
Not even try it.
if each of you got your hour, right? How long would these council meetings be, right? Too long. And so what happens when one person dominates is that the rest of you kind of shrink back, right? And so you don't get your equal say. Meanwhile, somebody has taken way more than their equal say. And so sensitivity in terms of not dominating the discussion is really critical. Sometimes that happens in the form of bringing up the same issue over and over and over, even when it's only tangentially related to the agenda item under consideration. In this same city, it was like anytime the word a, an, or the was mentioned, somebody was like, oh, this is my opportunity to talk about affordable housing, right? Or whatever their obsession was, right? And it was like, the rest of the council would be like, not again. And I kind of suggested to them, why don't you just develop a little shorthand? So you can just kind of have your say, like you can say something like, yes, and affordable housing, and be done with it, because everybody knows what the speech is going to be, right? So, there are different ways that I think you can develop a mutual respect around that. Mouthpieces. This is an odd phenomenon that I saw at a council meeting where the elected official wanted to stir the pot, But he didn't do it himself. He enlisted a couple of citizens to come in during public comment and stir the pot for him. Is that fair fighting? Is that a fair fight? No, right? It's a terrible passive-aggressive way, using your proxies to do your be litigating for you. I thought, man, that's got to stop. There's got to be a mutual pact that's got to stop. But I can see where the sort of reverse of that could happen too, where members of the community who have a particular issue that they really, really care about may try to use you as their mouthpiece or proxy, right? Kind of the same effect in reverse. And so you really want to think about, how you are spending your time and your resources on the council, because these things can become problematic. Individual behaviors. Have you ever seen instances where people just shoot themselves in the foot in terms of their effectiveness on a governing body because they're just not doing right in terms of their own individual behaviors? I'm not going to go through all of these, but listening more than talking, I think, is certainly one suggestion. Another is to understand one another's communication and learning styles. And so to the extent that you have opportunities, maybe in a retreat setting, to explore that a little bit, I think it could be helpful. A little bit more about personal conduct, body language. I have attended many a council meeting where I have known exactly who stands where with respect to any issue, and maybe with respect to the rest of the council, by the body language. I went to one of these things, and the mayor was sitting over here, and 6 members of the council were sitting like as far away as they possibly could, and I was like, maybe the body language here is trying to tell me something, right? But, sometimes it's stuff that you do inadvertently that may be communicating the wrong message. Like if you're turning your back or folding your arms while a particular person speaks, or you use that opportunity to pick up your cell phone and start texting, right? You may not even mean to be communicating that you don't care about what's being said, but that may be the message that's being conveyed, right? So body language, I think, is really important. Even if you're not feeling it, if you act as if by your body language, then I think that things will go much better in terms of the discussion. Interruptions. If you watch CNN or really any news channel, right, I think you end up thinking interrupting one another is perfectly normal and appropriate, is it? No. We have rules in council meetings, right? Somebody gets the floor and then yields the floor, and somebody else has the floor, right? So interruptions are not cool. They're not necessary. You will have your chance at the floor, right? But the other side of that is how you, the one interrupted, deals with an interruption, right? I see this on CNN all the time too, right? Somebody gets interrupted and they either start over or they're like, when you finish interrupting me, may I please go back to my original thought, right? And then they're spending 10 minutes back and forth on this issue of the interruption. You've got a mayor here who controls who has the floor and to whom you can look to say, Mayor, do I have the floor, right? And she will keep control of that traffic for you. So, you don't need to pull the CNN and say, would you please stop interrupting me? Because the mayor is there to do it for you with gavel, if necessary. Walking out.
We're the mayor pro tem. He
Yes.
does us, yes.
Yes.
Going on for an hour, I could never stop. I couldn't take it down.
Let's see, I think we've covered most of these, so I won't go through those. Let's see, in terms of the various roles of the players in the government, I think that's maybe important to touch upon, because you do have a really clear charter, right? You've got a council manager format, and it explicitly says that the manager is the administrative head of the municipal government and head of the administrative branch of the city government. I think they mean the same thing. But what they say is administration belongs over there, right? And you guys do governance legislation. So that is one of the black and white lines that the charter does draw. Staff. This is another place where I sometimes see partisanship happening, right? Us versus them. Sometimes I see it among newly elected officials because it might be that you're looking at the wrong model, right? If you look at the state or the feds, what happens when newly elected officials are swept in? First thing they do is clean house on the administration, right? And bring in their own staffs. Is that a valid approach to dealing with municipal staffs? I say no, right? Because if you're nonpartisan, your staff is Switzerland, right? And for them to be, swept out on those sort of partisan types of considerations is really hurtful. It cuts to the quick when an elected official looks at staff, your direct reports, and says, hey, you sure were loyal in serving that prior governing body, so I'm afraid you're going to have to go, right? No, because if we were loyal and effective in serving the prior governing body, I think it shows that we will be loyal and effective in serving you as well. So I hope those are the eyes with which your name will be viewed. Staff resources being used judiciously. I don't know if this is an issue in Littleton. I know certainly in cities where I was a city attorney, this would happen from time to time, where at every meeting and in between meetings, there would be requests for research, right? Sometimes there would be requests for research from everybody, and staff would be overwhelmed by requests for research. Certainly the staff is here to serve you, right? They're here to give you the information that you need, but you might want to think about, making sure that the staff isn't constantly going in 7 or more different directions in serving your need for information and research, because that does become, I think, tough on the staff. How's public comment going? Pretty well? Just a quick mention, we've now had 3 lawsuits among SURSA member municipalities around public comments. 2 of them have involved the same citizen who came in, wanted to talk about a particular topic, and was shut down by the presiding officer who said, I'm sorry, Mr. Citizen, you can't talk about that. Well, since when were there subject matter restrictions on public comment? There's a time limitation, but should you try to enforce a subject matter limitation? I think not, right? If a citizen comes in wanting to talk about his lawsuit against the city, what should you do? We're all ears. 3 minutes. You understand we can't respond to you because you're suing us, but have at it, Mr. Citizen, right? That should be your response. Or what if I let some F-bombs fly during public comment? Should you say, 1 more F-bomb, Ms. Tenoy, and I'm going to get the police to drag you out of here? Is that appropriate? That's what happened. Yes, it happened. Not me. But it happened, right? I feel like there's a better approach to dealing with that. And that would be maybe sort of an educational approach to say, we would understand your message better, Mr. Citizen, if you were to convey it to us without the F-bombs. So could you give that a try? And if he says F no, then you just say, thank you very much, your 3 minutes are up, right? Let him go for the 3 minutes. But we now have 3 lawsuits around that issue.
Are those winnable lawsuits? I mean, I know, who knows what a judge will say, but...
Yeah, the city is not going to win.
I do have a question on that too. So when a citizen comes to speak about something on the agenda when there will be public comment.
Yes, good point.
Can you address that?
Yes. If you've got a public hearing set aside for the matter, then I think it is appropriate just to say to the citizen, Mr. Citizen, could you please sign up again under the public hearing, or we'll move your name to the public hearing, because that's really when we need to hear your comments on that particular topic. And I think that's an important thing to do.
And I would concur with that because most of our public hearings are quasi-judicial. So we need those citizen comments as part of that record. And if they're speaking at another time, then we risk not having them in the record.
Gotcha.
Let's say someone wants to double their time, though. Is there?
That's what it would do.
Yeah. I mean, is there a option to, if someone's talking about a public hearing, not the public hearing? Is there anything?
That's not a valid way to do it. Because as Steve said, if it's not in the record of the public hearing, then it's as if it didn't happen, right? It's as if they didn't say anything, and it's as if you didn't hear it. And so it's completely ineffective, right? And so for everybody's interest, it's critical to put it into the public hearing because, that's where the transcript is going to be that a judge will look at to see, what evidence did you guys consider as the city council? It won't be the public hearing portion of the agenda.
So it's fair to say to that citizen, your comments cannot be, or will not be used in this public comment period. Your comments will not be part of council's consideration on the public hearing. We can only make a decision based on evidence that we hear during that session.
Correct.
This is outside of that.
Correct, yeah. And sometimes the citizen is like, I can only stay for public comment. I can't stay for the whole public hearing. So could I please just give my comments now? And your answer has to be, I'm sorry, I'm afraid not, right? Because among other things, right, the applicant may not be here yet. They may not have heard those comments. They're not going to be part of the record, and it's going to be problematic. And so even if you want to accommodate their time issues, that very act got a very nearby Board of Adjustment into huge trouble some years back, and we ended up ponying up a six-figure check over it.
So it's appropriate then to not allow them to speak on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can do it politely, right?
Yeah.
And to reinforce to them that it's in not just our best interest, but their best interest to reserve the comments for public hearings.
So, question.
Yes.
So some people are sick and can't attend a meeting, maybe chronically ill and they can't attend,
Yeah.
or they're in the hospital
Yeah.
temporarily and
Yeah.
they can't attend. Are they allowed to send their views and ask to have them included initially in the record for the public hearing?
I'm going to defer to Steve, but most cities do have a process for putting written comments into the record of a quasi-judicial matter.
Yes, what can happen is that if written material is submitted to the council in advance of the time for hearing, like many times you'll get emails, and we ask that you send those to Wendy because she will take all of those emails and she will incorporate those into the record and they will be part of the record. Now, if somebody comes up to, and says, I can't make the public hearing and it's 7:20 p.m. and they want to give something in writing, I'm going to have a problem with that because the trouble with it is no one has seen it, and including the applicant, and the meeting has already started. So as long as, and what we tell people is if you have that kind of comment, please get it to the city clerk so she can incorporate it in the record as well as provide each of you with it, because each of you need to also have it in order for you to consider it.
Do we have an explicit time for that? Is it 24 hours? Is it?
It would be right up until, literally right up until 5 o'clock. After 5 o'clock, normally the city clerk staff is gone, and at that point we are really prepping for the meeting. So up until the end of the business day of the council meeting, if we get it, we drop everything and make sure that gets into the record. But after 5 o'clock, we can't get it into the record.
And that's an
And that has been something that we've had. One of the things I'm also working on is that we need to update our Citizens Guide to Council meetings, and we're going to be updating that because that gets right to the very things that Tammy's talking about. And if you have in your rules things like public decorum, it becomes so much easier to defend a lawsuit because it's right there saying, here's the decorum, here's what's expected, you violated the rules, the presiding officer took action, and it's all connected.
So I did ask my question on purpose because we have done what I asked in the past, and I wanted this conversation to reaffirm that.
Yeah.
So that was sort of a fudgy question.
Good question.
We've also had a similar situation where so this happens when we get things in a packet and then there are changes to the packet and we don't see those until the meeting time. Is that okay? Because these are things that are published on the website as public information and then they're changed maybe last minute, but they haven't had the opportunity to be essentially reposted.
Yeah.
How do we deal with that?
Like the city manager.
Well, let's see, two issues there. First, we just had obviously an update to the current packet here for this evening after the study session. So we'll do that certainly long before the posting requirement. And so you got an email, highlighted the changes that were in there, and so it's then reposted by the clerk. In the case, I think maybe, Karina, you're referring to is PowerPoints that are part of the packet that, staff then somehow makes a change during the actual presentation. That's a practice that we're trying to cut off right at the knees. And so we are trying to back that up so that when PowerPoints or whatever's presented or put into the packet on a Thursday, that's it. So if staff makes a presentation on that following Tuesday with PowerPoint, it's the same one. That's what we're trying to get to.
Yeah, and I think that's a good practice. It's not so much a legal issue because from a legal meetings law standpoint, the only requirement is specific agenda information shall be provided if practicable. So that kind of leaves the door wide open for, those kinds of changes. But, as diligent elected officials who are studying your packets, right, I think this practice really does serve your needs, so.
And if I may, Tammy, obviously for the council, that makes you perhaps feel a little more comfortable with the issue, but also for the public as well. So when they get the information, they're not necessarily surprised when the presentation is somehow different. Now, if there is a change in the presentation, I don't want to change the PowerPoint, I just want the staff to somehow then make that comment publicly at the meeting.
Two more things. One, the U.S. Supreme Court has a case before it that talks about city councils and the extent to which you can or cannot enforce your rules of decorum. So stay tuned because there will be a pronouncement soon in terms of these F-bomb throwers who come to council meetings and what you can or can't do with regard to them. So there's going to be more developments there. And then the last thing I wanted to mention about public comment is this, that sometimes I see bashing start to happen during public comment, right? It might be staff bashing. I've seen it be elected official bashing.
Council bashing, we see it.
Yeah, and
Happened 2 weeks ago.
it's painful.
2 weeks before that.
It's painful to me when that happens, right? I feel like there ought to be a culture in the council chambers where people recognize that personal attacks really are not effective, are not called for, and should be, refrained from. But sometimes I see where the personal attacks, serve maybe a political purpose of one or more council members, and so I see more, right, or encouraging it, or agreeing with it, and man, that really hurts. When a staff member in particular, right, is the subject of bashing, right, because they have no ability to respond in that setting. It is really hurtful. It's really dirty pool, I think.
So is it? I'm just tossing an idea out, whether it's for you or them.
Yeah.
If somebody starts to bash or lets go of a pretty good bomb, if the mayor said immediately, council, let's take a 5-minute break. And every time that happened, even if we had 10 to 5-minute
A lot of
breaks.
breaks. Late meeting.
The point being that this is a timeout.
And I've been involved with
So
cities.
that, it doesn't escalate by the confrontation. It's just, hey, we don't play in the sandbox with this.
And I've been involved with cities where the adopted rules of decorum. One of the things will be, citizens during public comment, please do not make personal attacks on staff members or city council members. Please focus on the issue. And I've actually had a couple times where chairs have had to say, sir, if you don't stop the personal attacks, I'm going to have to withdraw my recognition of you and you will have to sit down. And usually that will, once that sort of standard is established in the rules of decorum, people begin to realize, listen, I need to focus my remarks on the issue at hand versus accusing this staff member of all kinds of heinous things. And it actually leads to better information from the citizens, because the citizens sometimes they do come in worked up. And if they see that and they understand that's not acceptable, then it focuses the comments on the issue.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so you might save your suggestions sort of as a continuum of consequences. You know, I think first, sort of an example approach is best. Second, a teaching approach is best. 3, you could start to get a little bit more, you know, and then finally somebody could say, I'd like to call for a 5-minute recess. You know, if things get too heated in the room, I think a recess is maybe the appropriate remedy.
And that's always my recommendation. If you get to the point where we're going to have to take some kind of very determined action, such as I've had a jurisdiction where we had to remove a person from the podium. My advice would always be to the mayor, please call a recess and then we'll take care of doing that. But we don't do that in the middle of trying to do business.
Yeah, and don't drag them bodily away if you can possibly help it. You know, I assume you do have a police presence. And so what you can do is call for the recess, and then somebody can say, sir, could I talk to you in the hallway for a moment? Right?
I've only had one time where I had to have a citizen come
and
walk out of the council chambers.
Yeah.
And hopefully once in a career, I think it's good enough.
Yeah, I agree.
Just to be clear, because what we're talking about here, we're saying that we can stop someone from personal attacks, etc. But if someone's dropping F-bombs, as long as they're dropping F-bombs on an issue, not to a person, so it's like, it's kind of weird. It's like, okay, they're belligerent, but it's what they're belligerent about.
I am not comfortable with stopping the personal attacks, like making it stop. I think teaching and leading by example is going to be your best bet. Because what if I say, you know, I'll attack that person if I want to, because that's what happened in two of those cities, right? All 3 of them. There were direct personal attacks on staff members, and there was a response, and that response is what led to the lawsuit. So, you know, I do feel like the best thing you can do is teach and lead by example, and if you have to veer towards the more coercive approaches, then consider it to have failed, and also consider it very possibly a precursor to a lawsuit. Just be prepared for it.
Would you review what your example and teaching technique is?
Yeah, you know, Mr. Citizen, may I stop you for a moment, because I know you've got an important message, but your F-bombs are distracting us from being able to understand your message. Furthermore, the personal attacks are keeping us from understanding what the underlying issues are. So if you could refocus away from the personal attacks and the language that is distracting us, then I think we would understand your message better. Do you think that's a possibility?
I agree with that. Almost always it works. In my experience, when you refocus the citizen, it almost always works. It's a rare thing when it hasn't worked, but almost always it will.
And I would even, let's hope it doesn't happen, but I would even suggest at that point, City Clerk, please start his 3 minutes over, so that then they recognize that you do want to hear what they have.
A reset button.
Yeah. Well done. Okay, well, I'm going to stop now because we've gone way over, and thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy.
Very good. He's over.
Well, so much of what Tammy said, I'm sitting here thinking, saw that, experienced experienced that, saw that, experienced that. As the mayor mentioned, I have almost 19 years experience in your seat. 11 on the council, 8 as mayor, and then my last year as mayor, I was president of the National League of Cities, where I did a lot of work all over the country.
Yeah.
And not since then, but during that time, I've done a lot of consulting with councils and staffs all over the country. Often called in when things are problematic, but often, usually called in at the beginning of a new council, like you are, to help set the stage for success. I'm a believer that, I think we ought to name councils like Congress does, the 101st, the 102nd, because every time there's an election, it's a new government. It's a reset. Even if it's all the same members, you have a chance to kind of revisit things and decide how this group of people is going to work going forward. So everything that Tammy said, I'm one of Tammy's biggest fans anyway, so I'm going to go quickly through this because you've already got most of this stuff ahead of time, so I'm going to show you where I'm going to focus in. That all the orientations pieces that you've had so far, but understanding your legal authority, setting policy, being accountable, providing resources, you've got the budget, all that stuff, and working with others is certainly a piece of it that Tammy talked a lot about. For me, effective wards are all about getting people writing in the same general direction, which is key. And what I'm going to talk about is what John Nalbandian really talks about. And John Nalbandian is a researcher, PhD. He runs the Masters of Public Administration program at the University of Kansas, which is one of the premier city manager schools. And he runs the program, teaches in it, but what made him, I think, uniquely qualified to talk about these issues is he also served on the Lawrence, Kansas Commission and served as mayor of Lawrence, Kansas. So he had a leg in both worlds, and from an academic perspective, I think there are only 3 or 4 academicians in the country that really focus on municipal government, primarily city councils. There are not very many. And what he says is that there are 3 characteristics to highly effective city councils and thereby highly effective communities. The willingness to confront big issues, the ability and the capacity to do so, and an effective relationship among themselves and with the professional staff. But there are obstacles that often get in the way of those things that we underestimate the importance of. One is this idea of competing values. And this is difficult because it leads to potential conflict. So as a quick example, I remember walking into council chambers one night, regular meeting, and it was packed. And nothing will strike fear in your hearts faster than a packed chamber. And you look at the agenda and it's like, wait a minute, there are no public hearings.
What's up?
We're not giving senior awards or beautiful yards, or there's no real reason for anybody to be here. So you run to the city manager, it's like, oh, why are they here? What do they want? What's going to happen? And clueless. So you wait for the public comment to open, and this is what happened in my city. One at a time, we need a stoplight. We need a traffic control device at this corner, and let me tell you why. So one person at a time, right? They obviously had gotten together to figure this out. One person comes and says, I've lived here forever. Quality of life has really deteriorated. There's more and more traffic. We need a stoplight. The next one comes and says, I have an elderly neighbor who goes across the street to play bridge. It's all about her quality of life. We need a stoplight. Another one says, you know what? I'm here asking for a stoplight, but if I lived on the north side of town, I wouldn't have to be here because it already would have been in there. Because you seem to forget that we even exist in this part of town. Another one will come up and say, I pay taxes. In fact, I figure I paid this much taxes over my lifetime. That ought to pay for a traffic light because I don't think I'm getting much for my tax dollar. So you get, I remember you, Peggy. We talked when you were campaigning. Remember, you complimented my roses and said how beautiful they were. And if I ever needed anything, I could come to you. I'm here. And I'll remember when it's time for the next election. And then there's always one at the end. I have children. My kids like to play in the front yard. How many children have to die before you do the right thing and put in a stoplight, right? I know my staff is in the back saying 2.4. You know, meet the warrants. How many does? So you have all these things coming up. What's the right decision? Well, your staff will remind you because you'll ask, staff, what do you know about, the traffic on such and such a street? Well, we know this has been, we've gotten a lot of citizen complaints, so we put out the device and we've tracked it, and unfortunately, it doesn't meet the warrants.
Thank you, Kathy.
Right? Because they are always proactive. They know what's going on. So here you are faced with a decision. Now you could decide to put in the stoplight. At which point, probably Tammy or somebody would say, that's a really bad idea because you've already adopted the Model Uniform Traffic Code, which says that if you put that in, you are no longer immune. And if somebody dies at that light, when you put in a device that was not warranted, we're not protecting you. It's all your liability. So you've got a whole set of values here, right? How many did you hear? Quality of life, equality, representation, concern for seniors, concern for children, right? And then effectiveness. We have to do the right thing with all our city's resources. And the room was full, and you heard lots of comments, but there's probably another 40,000 people out there in the city that you didn't hear from. No. And that's what makes it really hard. Because no matter how big the room is, when it's full, a few voices are very, very loud. And they're in your face. And it's hard sometimes to remember the other 40,000 people that aren't at the table. And that's one of the reasons why we tend to avoid this public conflict. Oh, let's just all be nice. We don't want to do that because it's hard. You guys will only governance is about value-based decisions. The easy ones, the 2 + 2 = 4, you've got a competent staff that knows the answers to those questions. That's the job of management. That's the job of administration. You get the ones where there's going to be disagreements. Because in a community this size, I'm sorry, my guess is I have 5 kids. In a family our size, half the time we couldn't even agree on what color the sky was, right? That's just because that's the way people are. So it leads to conflict, and value conflicts are the hardest, but that's what your job is all about. But we tend not to want to do that, because when we were brought up, right, if I fought in the front yard, I was one of 6 kids, and we had a fight, I got in trouble twice. Once for the fight, and once for doing it in the front yard, right? Don't air your dirty laundry in public. We were kind of taught that conflict is behind closed doors. If you have conflict in your day jobs, where do you handle it? Go in your office, you shut the door, you work it out, and then you come out and everything's good, okay? You guys don't get to do that. Every conflict, every conversation has to be done in public. And it makes it hard, right? And then there's this. Public officials who bicker are considered uncivil and counterproductive, but if you get along too well, you must be back scratching, suppressing debate, or having secret meetings. You can't win. It's hard. The other thing that gets in the way of being effective bodies is that we operate under a set of conditions that makes it hard to focus on the big picture, okay? And I'm going to go into these really quickly. Number 1 is a membership and group formation. In our experience in the outside world, in our work world, how do people get chosen to be on teams and chosen to work on projects? Education, experience, background, unique skills, traits, qualities. How are you chosen? What qualifications did you... Bottom line, what do you need to be elected or to serve? Age, residency, and citizenship.
And votes.
Well, you get the votes, but that's all you need to do to place your name on the ballot, right? no intelligence, no IQ test. I'm not saying anything about this board.
No experience.
No experience, no background.
In fact, a lot of people vote against experience.
Exactly. But the interesting thing is, you come with exactly what you need to do the job, which are ears and the ability to represent the values of the people who elected you. That's what you're here to do, right? But it's elections. Elections often are not nice. This is interesting.
Sober.
Sober, strong, sincere. They tend to be hard. And they're mean and nasty because research shows that's what works. And it's hard. So you run against the previous council, right? Things have to change. But when you're elected, you are now serving with half the people you just campaigned didn't know what they were talking about. If you are running at large, right, you have to distinguish yourself from the other people. How do you differentiate yourself? Well, you got to make me better, but when it's only age, citizen, and residents, and I don't know what I'm really talking about, how much can I differentiate myself as being better? So it's certainly easier to make the other person worse. The other thing that gets in the way, as Tammy alluded to this as well, is we all make promises. And our promises are in the form of, if you vote for me, I will. What did you hear? I. As Tammy said, once you're elected, you can't do anything. When I was on council, I could not do anything as an individual. Nothing at all. Even as mayor, I could sign documents only if the council had given me permission to do so, and I could run the meeting only because the charter gave me authority to do so. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot that you do as an individual. We had council members who never, ever understood that. And so my time in Northland, I called the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we were kind of the poster child for most of what Tammy said don't to do. Another thing that complicates things are your terms of office and the life cycle. Okay? Early on, people tend to be on their best behavior. It's still kind of a honeymoon period. I don't know if you found this, Tammy, but I'm finding that shorter and shorter. But you hit the ground running, and you can get things done from about here to about here. And then what happens? Election season kicks in again. So things that were not political here will be very political. And so when can you really focus and get the tough stuff done? You've only got a little period of time. Because those who are leaving office, number one, want to get done all those promises that they made when they were running and then figured out they couldn't do by themselves. Or number two, if I'm running again, or I'm thinking about my legacy, I'm not going to pass hard issues there that can and will be used against me in the campaign. So we just put it off. So you really have to be smart. And so our window of opportunity, your terms, you don't get a full 4 years. To really be effective, you have chunks of 4 years. That gets in the way. The other thing that gets in the way is also what Tammy talked about in the difference between governance and management, right? That your staff are the experts. They know everything. And they come up, and if it was up to them, the city would be run perfectly. And sometimes, and this comes in when there are staff council problems, because they know it all, but they don't get to actually make the decisions. And you get to make the decisions, but you don't know everything. But you don't need to know everything. And when I hear staff say, we need to give the council everything they need to know to make the right decision, my stomach turns a little bit, because it's like, they don't need to know everything. And whatever decision they make may not be technically correct, but it's the right decision, because they have the authority to make it. So there's that tension there. Okay? And your operating procedures. like we talked about, every conflict you have has to be done in public. Every conversation you have, 3 of you can't have a conversation unless it's posted. That's hard. It makes it really hard. It's hard to get to know each other. It's hard to understand where you're coming from. It's hard to know what issues are important to you and to each other. It's hard to know what values are most important. So find opportunities. There are wonderful opportunities. We're talking about CML. Go. Have dinner. Don't talk about specific city stuff. Talk about your families. Talk about your jobs. Talk about your aspirations. Get to know each other because that certainly helps. Robert's rules, right? We're so regimented. But remember, the meeting is your meeting. It's not the public's meeting. It's your business meeting. The public has a chance to talk to you, but that's not the only time they get to talk to you. And if, they want to talk more, then meet them at coffee. My guess is that Littleton does, just like so many other cities, there are multiple outlets for citizens to engage with you. It isn't the only option at the meeting. It's your meeting. Don't forget that. But we often get caught up and we can't talk about an issue until we have a motion and a second. Or if somebody does bring an issue up at public, we have to say, oh, thank you for bringing that up. We'll schedule it for future agenda. And the citizen walks away thinking what?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, government really doesn't care about what I think. They'll never come up. So it makes it hard. So all of these things kind of get in the way. They're obstacles, but we can overcome them. Having meetings like this certainly helps. Getting out of the chambers to have good conversation and study sessions is important. I haven't seen your council chambers, but it's probably like many others where you sit on a dais. Trying to have a conversation with somebody that you haven't right, is not conducive. And it's hard really to engage with the public because most council chambers I've seen, it's like coming to worship at the altar of the elected officials.
You see? Yeah, ours is.
Ours is particularly like that.
You've got to go in there. It's like the
Yeah.
United Nations.
Really?
Yeah, it's scary.
Well, speaking of United Nations, the best council chambers I ever saw was in Jerusalem, and they have a ton of members on the council, but they all sit in a circle all the time. And if a citizen wants to speak to the group, they come in and they join a circle and sit down. Oh. And when staff talks, they join the circle and they sit down. And it's like, it really is that
Even,
at us.
So where are the other ones? They're sitting.
Yes. Yeah, it's like theater in the round because council is the original reality TV show. Citizens are all sitting around observing, and when public comment come, they actually enter into the circles, which I think is brilliant. You think of the message that sends. So. The other thing that really gets in the way is that we come from different perspectives. Council and staff and each one of you bring a different set of values and perspectives and life experiences, which is why there are 7 of you making decisions and not just the ward czar or the mayor, right? There's value in that as well as potential conflict. And so it can often foster distrust. For example, we have different perspectives.
that's good.
You guys have probably seen this. Stages of, how the customer explained it. You can think about every different department head or each one of you. The council comes with a different perspective.
How the customer was billed.
I love it. The clerk always loves this, how the project was documented. And this is what they really wanted and needed. Right? We tend to all come with something different. But the key is that perception drives behavior. It's not the perception of reality, but if I perceive and interpret someone's comment or nonverbal, I then make a decision how to behave in return. And so all the things that Tammy was talking about in that personal conduct are so important. As she was talking, I'm thinking about, oh, I have an example for that one. Oh, I have an example for that one. Oh, I have another example. And now that for the new ones on council, you'll find yourself traveling and seeking out the public access channel on the hotel TVs, so you can see what other councils do. It's horrible. You start.
I do it everywhere I go.
Yeah, you start noticing other people's zoning or sign ordinances. Oh, they didn't do a good job. You know, you can't help it. You'll do it forever now. But I think this is key. This is a great clip, actually. Show us some. Remember that no one person council governs alone. We exercise our responsibility to work with others, to understand the issues that the council, the government, and the community want to address. That you must work with others to identify issues and decide what priorities to address. To be effective, and this, Tammy talked about these things, know how to listen to understand. I always think it's a little ironic that we call our public comment sessions, or even quasi-judicial, they're public hearings. Nothing in there says that you're actually listening to people, right? And so how do we really listen? It doesn't just happen at the meetings.
No, and the listen means also you have to try to hear what they are trying to say that they don't know how to say. I mean, that's what teaching is all about, is you're trying to hear what...
It is. One of my favorite, if you're leadership junkies, excellent books by Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky out of Harvard. First one was Leadership Without Easy Answers, and then Leadership on the Line, and then The Practice of Adaptive Leadership, where they really distinguish between technical problems and adaptive challenges. You all get the adaptive challenges, where the problems aren't clear, how you define them, much less the answers. If the problem is clear, the answer is clear, or the problem is clear and there are a variety of answers, that's management. That's staff. That's not government. And one of the things they say is adaptive leaders have to be able to listen to the music beneath the words. What is it that they're really saying? And give you an example that Tammy made me think of. So the good, the bad, and the ugly. It was good, and then term limits kicked in. We lost like 84 years of experience in one election, or actually over 2 elections. The bad, we had a split council. It was 5-4, and it was bad because I was on the 5. It got ugly in the next election. It went this way, and I was on a 4. It was so bad, we went, if you count the interims, actings, and permanent city managers, 7 and 8 years. Wow. Destroyed any progress we were trying to make. And it was because the council was so dysfunctional. And at one point, when I was on the majority, a council member sitting right next to me said, I'm so sick and tired of the majority winning all the time. We need to let the minority win every now and then. And I looked over and I said, you actually said that in public? Yes, this is ridiculous. The majority wins all the time. We need to take turns. We should win every now and then. And it was absurd. But in hindsight, what was she really saying?
She wasn't being heard.
They weren't being heard. And in hindsight, my lesson is just because you can doesn't mean you should. And how can you work, and I'll get to this in a minute, how do we really solve the problems? How do we listen more to build the bridges? Who do you think your most important constituent is?
Each other.
Well, besides your wife. It's your fellow council members. Actually,
Jerry. Yeah, that's right.
When I was at an NLC event and the mayor had dinner with the mayor of Beirut, Lebanon. And I'm thinking, North Glen, Beirut, what do we have in common, right? And we're sitting there and I asked him, so, Mayor, what's the biggest problem you face? And I'm thinking, and this was, 90s, things were still, and he's like, sidewalks. I'm like, what? He says, my wife, my daughters, we need sidewalks. And he went on and on about how they didn't have adequate sidewalks in the city of Beirut, and that was the number one thing. He said, I'm putting them in just to shut her up. So, wife is the most constituent. Yeah.
I think that's playing with the word constituent. I think
Well-
it really is who's your most important ally, because
Perhaps.
all council members are working for the city, for the citizens. But the citizens are diverse.
Yes.
But I don't view each other on council as constituents. We're here to try to get it done, and we need always to treat each other civilly, no matter how much we might differ in our perception of how to do it.
I absolutely agree. My point here is that if you want to get something done for a constituent, what do you need? You need you need 3 people to agree with you. And if you don't see your fellow council members as those constituents, they're just going to ram it through. You know, thinking of when Tanya was talking about single issue, we had a council member for, I think, 24 years, was a single issue council member. Ran against our water and sewer system. He said, I will never vote for anything having to do with the water and sewer system. If you trust him, he voted against a $500,000 refund to the city. Ooh, on principle. And it was like, that doesn't even make sense. And at the end of his term, we said, well, so what did you accomplish? I kept this from happening and kept this from happening. No. What did you actually get done? And it was not a lot. She talked about these, and again, I would underscore, get to know each other, your strengths, your weaknesses, how you view the world, how you communicate, how you solve conflicts, even address conflicts. There are some of you who will be natural competitors. I fight to win. Some who will be natural accommodators. I want to make the other person happy. Some who are natural collaborators. Well, at different times, you need different things. There are some of you who always look at the big picture, and some of you who need to know the details. Big picture people often perceive the detail people as micromanaging. You're wasting our time. You're asking too many questions, blah, blah, blah. And if you don't have an appreciation of what they bring, the relationships start to deteriorate. This is what I was talking about in terms of really understanding the interests that you have. Because often we come in with positions, and often our residents and citizens have a position, even if they're not fully informed on what the issues are. So they come in, it's like, this is a position, this is a position, this is what I want you to do. Well, that creates this conflict zone, and it's really difficult to bridge positions. If you can seek to identify the underlying interests, well, why do you have the position that you have? Why is this important to you? What's really at stake? Then you can start to identify the mutual interests, and here's this zone of compromise, and where you can start to make some changes. And this is the part where I should have listened, and the minority wouldn't feel like they never won. So, separate people from the problem, easier said than done, right? Focus on interests. On really difficult issues, I think this is important. If we can agree on objective criteria ahead of time, this is what we're going to use to evaluate our alternatives to make the decision. Often the debate is not nearly as nasty because we agreed ahead of time on the criteria. Then it's a matter of trying to do what's best to meet the criteria, and it separates people from position. She mentioned civility. It's really hard. It's getting harder to maintain civility in our cities. Primary piece here for me is that we know that dysfunctional boards and councils result from a lack of clarity in roles, goals, and expectations. Well, you've already had an initiation into the roles and orientation toward that. You've had your retreat that really talks about the goals. The last thing are the expectations, and this is really important. Now, role clarity is important too. What's governance? What's management? What does the mayor do? what's our role in a quasi-judicial, what's our role here kind of thing. Your goals, I love this. I'm not a baseball fan, but they have great analogies or metaphors. Your responsibility, his responsibility was to get the 25 guys playing for the name on the front of the shirt and not the name on the back. And that's what you were talking about, Peggy. That everyone's playing for Littleton, not Novak. Again, sometimes easier said than done. In terms of expectations, let me just set it up this way. My husband and I have been married 34 years, 35 this summer. He was, when I met him, young, single, living on his own. His mom died when he was younger. He could cook, he could clean, he did the dishes, he did the laundry, and his apartment was always immaculate. I'm thinking, ka-ching. I grew up, I was one of 6 kids, and I had a practically perfect mother. We had a laundry chute, clothes went down. The next day, they magically appeared. Washed, ironed, and folded and put away. I went off to college, got married before I graduated, was still living at home. We got married. 2 weeks after the honeymoon, my husband comes to me and he says, so I'm all out of underwear. And I'm like, so? But in my mind, I'm thinking, you have 2 weeks worth of underwear? And he says, well, it's the wife's job to do the laundry. Yeah. Oh. I know. I'm like, really?
No.
I know, the guys are still like, yeah? What's wrong with that?
Looking around.
I'm thinking, what else do you think?
I'm listening.
That's right. What else do you think it's the wife's job to do? And we proceeded to have one of many long drawn-out discussions about what I thought a husband should do and what he thought a wife should do. Well, what happened is that we had expectations like this. He had this whole set of images about what that role was about that I didn't necessarily share or agree with. And so this was his expectation. This was my performance. This was a zone of disappointment. And if you don't get this right, what happens to this zone of disappointment? It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's the same way in the positions that you're in right now. Each one of you in your head has, whether you realize it or not, you've got a set of expectations about what it means to be on council. And until you articulate them and agree to them, you are bound to disappoint each other. And that disappointment leads to frustration, anger, miscommunication, lashing out, perceived intent around behaviors. And Tammy can say it's like this downward spiral. And pretty soon, the only ones that are really suffering are all the citizens. And there's an old African proverb, I think always, the wisest ones are always old African proverbs, that when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. When you all are disappointing and anger and doing all these things, it's the citizens and the community that really suffers. So, I don't know if we have...
How much do you need?
It really depends on you all. And this is something you could probably do later. But typically what I ask, and I do this, in fact I was with Golden just over the weekend, whenever I do council retreats, newly electeds, I start off and I ask you, write down, what do you expect of your fellow council members?
Does this also include what you expect them not to do?
Yes, yes. What do I expect them to do and not to do? And so it's writing it down and then it's sharing, discussing, and agreeing. So I think you guys could do this at a later date because I just know that.
Yeah, we have actually, I think in a few weeks or so, we will have our conversation about updating our protocols and stuff. And so we can loop that in.
And actually, it's a perfect discussion to have prior to the protocols.
Okay.
Because often things emerge that then get codified in the protocols. You know, for example, I expect that if you know about something happening in my neighborhood, you give me a heads up. It's in my ward, again, determining management and governance. I expect you to be honest with me. I expect that if you disagree with me, that you give me the courtesy of understanding where the disagreement is. I expect that there be no surprises, right? The worst thing that happens, and this happened during our ugly time, is you come to a council meeting and you've got a council member lying in wait. I'm just waiting for you to say the right thing, and then it's going to be, give me a heads up. I mean, staff, I usually do this with what do you expect of staff and what does staff expect of the council, and this is no surprises. Not a problem questioning staff at all. You should. Give them a heads up. I'm going to ask this question, or I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? Okay, I understand, but I'm still going to ask the question because I know the answer, but I'm asking it because I want Joe down the street to hear the answer. Even that set of expectations, if you're asking it on behalf of someone else, give me a heads up so I don't jump on you because you're wasting our time. And I'm thinking that you didn't read the packet. Okay? Timeliness. I expect you to respond in a timely manner. Oh, what does timely mean? Are you just waiting for my phone call? Or is it 24 hours? Okay. So often these things, I expect you to support the council's decision. What does that look like? What's the language that we agree to use? So those kinds of things. So I would encourage you to think about that and then maybe have that as a precursor to your protocol.
Yeah, it's good. This can be some homework so we can come with some of this stuff and be ready to have a good conversation. I like it. Thank you.
So Tammy and I have both talked a lot. Any questions or?
No, well done.
Questions, comments? I have a couple things. First of all, I want to thank you guys, and we could have done this much longer because you guys abbreviated your presentations for us, but it's always very valuable. It's always good information. It's always stuff that is, we are in a different world, and having the support from people like you guys that are working to support our continued development and our growth is fabulous, and we really appreciate it. Thank you for taking your evening to be with us.
Well, and know that if you ever have any questions, sometimes it's nice to talk to somebody who's not on the council, you're not in office anymore. Colorado is actually a pretty small town.
Yeah.
So if there are ever questions, feel free to contact me.
Oh, thank you, Kathy.
So Deb,
On behalf of Littleton, we want to give you guys... Yeah.
so can we get a printout of
Sure.
this one too?
Sure.
Yes, it's, yeah.
Sure. A little party gift. Just something to,
Nice.
yes, take to your next town and show them where you were before. You bet. And then I just have one quick thing with council before we go to our council meeting. And I don't know if you guys are, Peggy and Jerry are very well aware of what my favorite thing to do is give books. And one of the things that, a book that I have enjoyed for a very long time and wanted to share with council, and it's called The Four Agreements, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. And The Four Agreements, it's by Don Miguel Ruiz. It's basically a wisdom book. It's not of a specific spirituality or any of that. It's really about kind of a self-growth. The Four Agreements, and this kind of walks through those, and it's a great kind of a guidepost. I like to call it my North Star. One is be impeccable with your word. Speak with integrity, say only what you mean, avoid using words to speak against yourself or to gossip about others. Use the power of your word in the direction of truth and love. The second one is don't take anything personally. Nothing others do is because of you. What others say and do is a projection of their own reality, their own dream. When you're immune to the opinions and actions of others, you won't be the victim of needless suffering. Number 3 is don't make assumptions. Find the courage to ask questions, to express what you really want, communicate with others as clearly as you can to avoid misunderstanding, sadness, and drama. With just this one agreement, you can completely transform your life. And then the 4th agreement, always do your best. Your best is going to change from moment to moment. It will be different when you're healthy as opposed to sick. Under any circumstances, simply do your best and you will avoid self-judgment, self-abuse, and regret. This is really a guide, something that can help support you on your journey through counsel. Because as we said, it can be a lonely world. It can be challenging. We are, in a fishbowl, and so oftentimes there are things that we internalize and we have to deal with. And so sometimes just being kind to yourself is where you need to go. And when you look at the 4 agreements, these are agreements you make with yourself. These are not agreements that you need to make with anybody else. These are agreements you make with yourself. So I have a book for everyone, and what I'd like to do before we step into our meeting, which we will in moments, I'm going to pass these around, and I would just ask each of us to sign our name in each book. And so we will all have our book signed by each of us, just as a sign of support that the 7 of us are supporting our work together. And then you can do with the book as you choose. So I will sign and pass along. And you don't need to write anything, you just put your name. Unless you're Jerry, who's going to want to write a novel.
Oh, yeah. I'm thinking of you.
You get your bank account and your birth date on there?
Oh, you want the social security number? We will convene the regular council meeting in 10 minutes, 8:05, or 7:55, I'm sorry. Yeah?
Yes.
This study session's adjourned.